The wind moved across the dry plains like a restless spirit that night. It whistled through the tall grass and touched the wooden walls of the small ranch house standing alone at the edge of the open land. The ranch belonged to Thomas Gray, a man who had lived most of his life under the wide sky of the Arizona Territory. He was tall, with weathered hands and eyes that had learned to watch the horizon carefully. The land around him stretched for miles. During the day it looked endless, golden fields, hills far away, and a sky so blue it felt like it had no end. But at night it could turn cold and lonely. The wind made the house creak softly, like the voice of the desert itself. Inside, Thomas sat by the small stove, slowly feeding it pieces of wood. The orange light flickered across the walls, giving the room a warm glow, though the air still carried a bite of cold. It was winter, and the temperature dropped quickly after the sun went down. Thomas was used to the silence. He had built this life with his own hands, a quiet ranch, a few horses, some cattle, and the land. It wasn't easy, but it was his. Most nights were the same. Finish work, eat a simple meal, sit by the fire, and listen to the wind. He had no family left nearby. His father had passed years ago, and his brother had moved east. Friends came and went, but the land stayed. And so did he. That night, as he sipped a cup of warm coffee, something broke the usual silence. It was soft, almost lost in the wind, a sound like a knock. At first, Thomas thought it was the wind shaking a loose board. But then it came again, clearer this time. A gentle, uncertain knock at the door. He stood up slowly, surprised. It was late. No one visited at this hour, not on a night like this. He walked toward the door, the floor creaking beneath his boots. He placed his hand on the handle and listened again. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice steady. There was no answer, only the wind. But something told him someone was standing outside. He opened the door carefully, letting the cold rush in. The lantern on the wall shook a little as the wind entered. There, standing on the porch, was a girl. She was young, maybe 16 or 17. Her black hair hung in messy strands, and her clothes were thin, far too thin for such a cold night. She held a small blanket tight around her shoulders, but it wasn't enough to stop her from shivering. Her cheeks were red from the cold, and her lips trembled as she tried to speak. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Thomas could see that she wasn't from town. She had the look of someone who had grown up close to the land, someone who understood its silence. She was Apache. Life on the frontier had taught Thomas to be careful. Over the years, he had heard many stories, some told with fear, others with anger. But what he saw now wasn't a story. It was a real person, a young girl alone in the cold. She lifted her eyes slowly and spoke in a soft, broken voice. "I can warm you tonight." Her words were simple, not loud, but they carried something deeper. They weren't the words of someone making a promise or a plan. They were the words of someone asking for a chance to survive. Thomas felt the cold wind pushing at his back, and for a heartbeat, he hesitated. He had spent years building a wall around his heart, learning not to trust too quickly. But as he looked at her shaking hands and tired eyes, he saw no threat. He saw someone who had nowhere else to go. "Come in," he said quietly. The girl stepped inside slowly, as if unsure whether she was truly welcome. The warmth from the stove touched her skin, and she let out a small breath, almost like a sigh of relief. Thomas closed the door behind her and hung his coat on the hook. She stood close to the fire, stretching her hands out to feel its heat. Her fingers were thin and pale from the cold. "What's your name?" Thomas asked gently. She hesitated before answering, her accent soft. "Nayeli." It was a pretty name. He nodded slowly. "I'm Thomas," she gave a tiny nod back. She didn't talk much, and he didn't push her. He could tell she wasn't used to speaking English often, but she understood enough. For a while neither spoke. The fire filled the silence with soft crackling sounds. Thomas sat down on the chair, and Nayeli knelt near the stove, warming herself. He noticed the dust on her boots, the way her blanket was torn at the edges. She must have walked a long way. "Where's your home?" he asked finally. She looked at the floor. "Far," she whispered. Her answer was enough. Thomas didn't need more details to understand. He had seen how harsh life could be for anyone caught between the edges of the frontier. He went to the small shelf and brought a tin cup of warm coffee. "It's not sweet," he said as he handed it to her, "but it'll help." Nayeli accepted it carefully, wrapping both hands around the cup as if it were the most precious thing she had touched in a long time. She blew on it softly before taking a sip. Her shoulders slowly relaxed. Outside, the wind continued to howl, but inside the small cabin, the air began to feel a little less cold. Thomas didn't ask too many questions. He had learned that sometimes silence spoke louder than words. He simply added more wood to the fire and handed her an old blanket from the chest. It wasn't new, but it was warm. She wrapped it around herself and sat on the floor close to the warmth. He watched her out of the corner of his eye. There was something both fragile and strong about her. She looked like someone who had been through more than her years should have allowed. The night grew darker, and the storm outside grew stronger. Thomas checked the windows, making sure they were shut tight. Nayeli sat quietly, listening to the sound of the wind hitting the house. "You can stay here tonight," Thomas said finally. Her head turned slowly, and her dark eyes met his. "Thank you," she whispered. It wasn't much, just 2 simple words, but they held more weight than any long speech. Thomas laid a blanket on the floor near the fire for her to sleep on. He gave her a pillow too, one he hadn't used in a long time. She seemed almost unsure of how to accept kindness, as if she hadn't been shown much of it before. As she lay down, Thomas sat back in his chair and stared into the fire. He thought about how strange life could be. He had spent so many nights alone, expecting nothing to change. And now, without warning, a young girl had appeared at his door, bringing with her a quiet mystery. He didn't know where she came from or what she had seen, but he knew one thing for sure. If he hadn't opened the door tonight, she might not have survived the storm. As the minutes passed, the room became warmer. Nayeli closed her eyes, holding the blanket close. Her breathing became slow and steady. For the first time in what was likely many days, she felt safe. Thomas looked at her and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: care. Not the loud, heavy kind, but a quiet, human care. It surprised him. He was a man used to taking care of animals, not people, but somehow letting her stay had felt like the right thing to do. Outside, the sky cleared a little, and a silver moon shone through a thin layer of clouds. The storm wasn't over yet, but its rage had softened. The land lay quiet again, waiting for morning. Thomas leaned back and listened to the crackling of the fire. He remembered his father telling him long ago, "The land teaches you many things, boy, but the hardest lesson is learning when to open your door." Tonight he had opened it, and something told him this was only the beginning. Morning came slowly over the wide land, spreading soft light across the dry hills. The storm had passed, leaving the world still and quiet. A thin layer of frost covered the ground, sparkling like small diamonds as the sun rose. Inside the little wooden house, Thomas Gray opened his eyes to the warm orange glow of the stove. He could still hear the wind moving gently through the grass outside, but it no longer sounded harsh. It sounded peaceful. Nayeli was still asleep near the fire, wrapped tightly in the blanket he had given her. Her face looked calm, and for the first time she didn't seem afraid or tired. Her hair lay softly on the pillow and her breathing was slow and steady. Thomas sat up and watched her for a moment. It surprised him how natural it felt to see someone else there. For so long he had been alone, waking up to silence. He stood and quietly put on his boots. Outside, the sky was a soft pink and the air was cold but fresh. He walked to the small barn and checked on his horses. They neighed softly when they saw him, happy for the hay and water he brought. The sun climbed a little higher, and the world slowly came back to life. When he returned inside, Nayeli was sitting up, rubbing her eyes. She looked around like she was making sure it hadn't all been a dream. When she saw Thomas, she gave a small, shy smile. "Good morning," he said gently. She hesitated, then repeated softly, "Good morning." Her accent made the words sound delicate, like a quiet song. "I have some bread," Thomas said, handing her a piece. He also poured some warm milk into a tin cup. She accepted it with both hands, just like she had done with the coffee the night before. She ate slowly, as if each bite mattered. Thomas didn't ask her too many questions. He didn't want to make her feel like she had to explain everything at once. Instead, he went about his usual morning work, fixing a broken piece of the fence and checking the water trough. To his surprise, Nayeli followed him outside after finishing her food. The cold air turned her cheeks pink, but she didn't complain. She watched what he was doing carefully, as if trying to learn. Then, without a word, she started helping, handing him tools, holding the wood in place, and brushing snow from the rails. Her movements were quiet but sure. Thomas didn't say much, but inside he felt something unusual. He had worked alone for years, Now, for the first time, someone else moved beside him. It made the work lighter, easier. Over the next few days, Nayeli stayed. Each morning, she helped with the chores in her own silent way. She fed the horses, carried water, and swept the floor of the little house. She even found a few broken places in the roof and pointed them out to Thomas. He fixed them while she held the ladder steady. She didn't talk about her past, and Thomas didn't ask. All he knew was her name, Nayeli, and that she was stronger than she looked. Though she spoke little, her eyes spoke plenty. She would sometimes look out at the distant hills with a faraway expression, like she was remembering something from another world. In the evenings, after the work was done, they sat near the stove. Thomas would sometimes tell her simple stories, not grand adventures, but stories of life on the land. She listened closely even if she didn't understand every word. Slowly, she started speaking more, a few words here and there. Sometimes she would laugh quietly, and Thomas would notice how her whole face softened when she smiled. Winter on the frontier was long, and storms came often. But with Nayeli there, the house no longer felt empty. Her quiet presence filled the space like a warm light. One evening, as another cold wind blew outside, Nayeli surprised Thomas. She handed him a small bundle of sticks and dry leaves she had collected. With gentle hands, she built the fire without a word, arranging everything so neatly that the flames rose quickly and steadily. "You know fire," Thomas said with a small smile. She nodded. "My father taught me," she answered softly. It was one of the few times she had spoken about someone from her life. Thomas didn't press for more, but he nodded with understanding. The days turned into weeks. The land stayed cold, but inside the cabin it was warm. Thomas found himself waiting for her smile in the mornings, for the sound of her footsteps on the wooden floor, for the way she looked out at the hills. It wasn't the loud kind of bond, no big words, no sudden moments. It was quiet, gentle, like the slow melting of winter snow. But as the frost began to fade and the sun stayed longer in the sky, Thomas noticed a change in Nayeli. She spent more time outside, walking near the hills. She watched the horizon in silence, like the land itself was calling her name. He knew what it meant before she even said it. One afternoon, when the sun was bright and the snow had almost melted, Nayeli came to him near the fence. She held the blanket he had given her the first night. Her eyes were calm but a little sad. "I go home," she said quietly. Thomas stopped what he was doing. A part of him had expected it, but another part had hoped it wouldn't come so soon. He nodded slowly. "You have people waiting for you," he said. She nodded. "My family." There was no need for more words. She had found warmth here for a time, but her life belonged beyond the hills. She folded the blanket carefully, then looked at him and held it out. "Keep it," Thomas said gently. "It kept you warm. Maybe it will again." For the first time since she arrived, Nayeli's eyes filled with emotion. Not loud emotion, but quiet and real. She hugged the blanket close and gave a small nod. The next morning, the land was soft with early spring light. Birds sang in the distance, and the wind carried a warmer touch. Nayeli stood at the edge of the porch with the blanket over her shoulders. Thomas stood beside her. "Thank you," she whispered. He didn't say much in reply. He just looked at her and gave a small smile. Some things didn't need long words. She walked toward the hills slowly, her steps steady. Thomas watched her until she became a small figure against the wide land. He didn't call out to stop her. He knew she needed to go just as much as he needed to stay. When she disappeared behind the ridge, Thomas stood alone again, just like he had before. But it didn't feel the same anymore. The house behind him was still small, the wind still moved through the grass, and the land was as wide as ever. But inside, something had changed. He walked back into the house. It was quiet, but it was not empty. The chair where Nayeli had sat near the fire was still there. The tin cup she used for coffee was still on the shelf, and the warmth of those winter nights seemed to still live inside the wooden walls. Thomas sat down near the stove and stared at the flames. He thought about how life could surprise you when you least expected it. A stranger at the door on a cold night had become a memory he would carry forever. Weeks passed and the land turned green again. Thomas returned to his work as he always did. He fixed fences, cared for the horses, and walked the land each morning. But every now and then, when he looked at the hills, he thought of a quiet girl with dark hair and gentle eyes. He imagined her walking back to her family, wrapped in the old blanket. He hoped she was warm. The winter they shared was short, but it left a mark. It reminded Thomas of something simple yet powerful. Kindness doesn't need loud words. Trust doesn't need to be forced, and sometimes, two people can change each other's lives without even planning it. One night, long after she had gone, Thomas sat by the stove again. The fire cracked softly. Outside, the moon was bright over the fields. He closed his eyes and could almost hear her soft voice saying good morning again. He smiled. Life on the frontier would always be hard. But now it also held a memory of warmth, and that Thomas knew would stay with him for the rest of his days.